Delighted to be able to introduce and welcome to Martin Kingsbury. Martin worked was really Faber Music for many years. Faber Music, one of one of the world's leading publishers, and drop on Sir Malcolm Arnold. It was in fact Donald Mitchell, the lights are burning very severely. We may have colour down here. It was Donald Mitchell that took off Sir Malcolm, and he became a Faber composer for many years. And Martin looked after him for all that time, and I know he has some wonderful stories to recount. So I'm delighted to welcome Martin Kingsbury.
Working with Malcolm Arnold, the Faber years. Like many things in Malcolm's very eventful life, the Faber years began at a long and very liquid lunch. It was on the 2nd of February 1965 at the Savile Club, and he was with Donald Mitchell, who had recently been appointed by Faber to head its new music publishing venture. This was a time of new beginnings for Malcolm. He had recently remarried, and he and his second wife, Isabel, had left London and set up in Cornwall. The flow of his commissions for film scores, usually 6 or more per year in the 50s, had by now dwindled to a trickle. So, to make up some of the lost income, Malcolm stepped up his conducting engagement and was now giving concerts with many of the principal English symphony orchestras. More germanic to the lunch, he had recently quarrelled with Michael Dyack of Patterson, his publisher since 1952, and was seriously thinking about moving elsewhere. Malcolm's output of compositions was already huge and astonishingly diverse. In the public's view, he was the composer of ever-popular concert works, such as the English and Scottish dances, Tam O'Shanter, Bacchus, and so on, as well as the joke pieces for the Hoffnung concerts, and, of course, film scores such as The Bridge on the River Kwai and The Inn of the Sixth Happiness. The very popularity of these works, however, coupled with his very public rejection of the avant-garde music currently in vogue, had seriously undermined his reputation as a composer of serious works, so far as the musical establishment was concerned. You perhaps know the legendary dictum of a Treasury official. $1 billion here, $1 billion there, and soon you're talking real money. The cynical line taken by the music establishment towards Malcolm went something like, a good tune here, a good tune there, and soon you're talking big money. But the root of the problem was that his symphonies and other weightier works, particularly the more recent ones, were considered too much of a stylistic mishmash to be taken seriously. They were shunned by the public, who found them discordant and unsettling, and generally savaged by critics. But not by all critics. Some were sympathetic. Colin Mason, for example, Hugo Cole, and, significantly, Donald Mitchell. Donald had emerged in the late 40s as a music critic of uncommon ability and insight. He wrote first for the polemical journal Music Survey, which he had founded and which championed new music causes. Later, he wrote for the Daily Telegraph and other periodicals. He developed a scholarly interest in Britten and in Mahler, editing a book on Britten's music and publishing the first volume of a major 3-part study of Mahler's life and works. At Britten's request, he worked for a time at Britten's publisher, Boosey and Walks, to look after his interests there. Donald's sympathetic interest in Malcolm's music and a perceptive article on his Fourth Symphony after its 1960 premiere brought the two men together. They became friendly and saw each other from time to time. Donald, meanwhile, had joined Faber and Faber to build up a list of music books. When Britten decided to leave Boosey in 1964, he let it drop that if Faber would start publishing music under Donald Mitchell's direction, he would be their first composer. By the end of that year, Britten's idea was a reality. It was then that Donald suggested to Malcolm that they should meet to discuss publishing. The lunch proved fruitful. By the time the two of them staggered into the street around 4 o'clock, it had been agreed that Malcolm would come to Faber. He brought the score of his double violin concerto with him, which was not yet placed with another publisher. On the back of this score, a few words entrusting the work to Faber were hastily scrawled and signed by both of them, there, in the street. This was to be the start of a long and successful publishing relationship, based on mutual trust, admiration, and respect. Donald was a strong personality. He was energetic, he had authority in the world of new music, a wide range of contacts, and a genuine appreciation of Malcolm's music. It was no surprise that Malcolm saw him as someone whose support would be valuable and who could help bolster his flagging fortunes with the musical establishment. However, Malcolm was also taking a sizable punt, since Faber had not yet published a single note of music. In fact, the music department then comprised only 2 people, Donald and the secretary. The following month, I joined as Donald's assistant, and a production manager was later recruited to look after the preparation and printing and publications, so that when Faber Music was incorporated at the end of 1965 as a separate company, it had just 4 full-time employees. From the Faber perspective, Malcolm was a real catch. Of the 3 reputedly highest-earning living English composers of serious music at the time, Britten, Walton, and Arnold, 2 were now with the fledgling music publishing house of Faber. I wonder how many of you have read Anthony Meredith and Paul Harris's excellent book, Malcolm Arnold, Rove Genius. Show of hands? A lot of you? Yes, a lot, as I thought. Well, when I was preparing this talk, I marshalled my Arnold stories and looked through the correspondence archive at Faber, only to discover that everything I told the authors and most of the interesting letters in the archive were there in the book. So a bit of duplication in what I say today is inevitable. But for any of you who don't know the book, I can strongly recommend it. As a biography, it is extremely well researched, and it offers fascinating, if sometimes speculative, ideas on how the content of Malcolm's works reflects the context of their composition. The early exchanges of letters between Donald and Malcolm are revealing about their developing relationship and show traits that will persist into the future. In Donald's letters, the tone is warm and appreciative, yet measured, authoritative, and practical. Meredith and Harris liken his role to that of the wise elder brother, even though Donald was, in fact, younger than Malcolm. Malcolm, on his side, writes briefly and to the point. He's delighted and flattered. Yes, he'll prepare again a reduction of the double violin concerto. In fact, he never does. A more personal vein emerges too when he adds, I enjoy writing music, and it never fails to surprise me that when I get my usual hostile critical reception, Music to me, primarily, is an act of friendship, and the present-day business of performing music is such a cutthroat affair that it negates what seems to me to be the whole reason for the existence of music. Now there's a statement from the heart. Support is clearly what Malcolm wanted, and support he now gets, big time. Donald is tireless. He immediately gets a live broadcast of the double violin concerto lined up at the BBC, and a string of concert performances too. When it transpires that Malcolm currently has no commissions for orchestral works, he fires off letters to music festivals, agents, orchestras, conductors to get him some. He suggests possible new works for Malcolm to write, a concerto for orchestra, a set of Cornish dances. He soon introduces Malcolm to an excellent agent for his conducting. As new compositions arrive, Donald hurries an appreciative letter off to Malcolm and immediately galvanizes everyone at Faber into publishing and promoting them. It's all very exciting. As the spate of activity continued, Faber handled so few composers in the early days, Malcolm's music received a lot of attention from all of us, while on a personal level, Donald continued to provide good advice and appreciative support. Within a few years, Malcolm writes to him, "You have always been extremely encouraging and one of the very few people to see what I've been trying to do. All this I always appreciated more than I can say. Very many thanks for everything." These are sentiments that he will repeat again in the future. Donald, for his part, writes to Malcolm on his 50th birthday, sending, quote, "A warm expression of gratitude for the music which you have written and which has given me and so many others so much pleasure. I have often been profoundly moved by your art." So, what were the Faber years? They were the years 1965 to 1987, during which Faber was the principal publisher of Malcolm's new music. Donald Mitchell headed the company throughout these years and remained the linchpin of its relationship with Malcolm. I also worked at Faber for the whole of the period, becoming a director in 1972 and later managing director when Donald became chairman. The company grew slowly at first, but from the early 80s increased significantly in size, diversifying but keeping contemporary music at the center of its activities. Entrepreneurial zeal continued to be paramount. Donald once said to me that much as we might enjoy listening to the music we published, the music of a tinkling cash register was no less enjoyable. We had manifold dealings with Malcolm throughout the Faber years, yet these were, of course, very much affected by the current phase of his manic depressive illness, his alcoholism, and any psychotic episodes. 5 main periods in Malcolm's life can be identified during those years, based on where he was living and his predominant state of health. These periods are as follows. First, Cornwall, 1965 to 1972. Generally stable and productive, but a bit bumpy towards the end. Secondly, Dublin, 1972 to 1977. Reasonably stable and productive, but sliding into turbulence. Third, Belsize Park, London, 1977 to 1979. Years of great mental turmoil with periodic hospitalization. 2 compositions only in this period, and it's really utterly amazing that there were any at all. 4. Northampton, 1979 to 1984, so-called lost years, mainly in a psychiatric hospital. 1 composition at the end of the period. 5th and final, Norfolk, 1984 to 1988. Rescue to Calmer Waters, 7 compositions. So what was it like then, working with Malcolm? I'm going to answer this by looking at a number of particular topics, but you must understand that much of what I say relates to times of stability in Malcolm's life, not right across the board. I won't say much about individual musical works. I'd like to, but there won't be enough time, and in any case there are probably others here today who are much better qualified to do so than I am. First, then, business matters. Malcolm was punctilious in dealing with business matters, unless he was composing, which took precedence over everything else. And letters tended to get put on one side, unanswered. With his considerable experience of the music world, he knew what he could reasonably expect in any deal, and he never budged. He refused, for example, to accept a general publishing agreement, such as we had with our other house composers, under which all new compositions could be contracted to Faber. Nevertheless, for over 20 years, he loyally placed with us all his new works, bar a few perfectly reasonable exceptions, though he was at liberty to give any of them to another publisher had he so wished. On commissioned works, Malcolm liked to deal personally with the commissioner on all aspects, including the commission fee. This was unusual. Other composers wanted us to deal with their commissions as long as we consulted fully with them. But Malcolm was happy nevertheless for Faber to scout for new commissions for him, and we did so. Once there was interest, we asked the commissioner to pursue the idea directly with Malcolm. And there were a number of Faber-led commissions, which included the Concerto for 28 players, a Fleischer Orchestra, the Seventh Symphony, and the Philharmonic Concerto. Related topic: money. Malcolm liked making money, but was always careless with it, particularly when in a manic phase. He got used to earning big sums on writing film scores, and he continued to spend on a gargantuan scale even when his lucrative film work dried up. I can't resist telling you the story of why David Lean sacked Malcolm as his film composer. It was told to me by the film director Tony Palmer, who got it from William Walton. Bridge on the River Kwai was, of course, hugely successful. Lean's next film was Lawrence of Arabia. As soon as he edited it, he invited Malcolm to a private screening in one of those Soho studio cinemas so that he could start thinking about the music. The screening was in the afternoon, and Malcolm rolled up with Walton after what was clearly a very boozy lunch. David Lean agreed to Walton joining Malcolm at the screening, and the two settled down to watch, while Lean withdrew. At the end of the film, there was silence in the studio, punctuated by the odd snore. "Well, Malcolm," said Lean, coming back, "what did you think of it?" Malcolm started out of sleep. Lighting on a memory of camels in the desert, he replied, "A bit of a travelogue, wasn't it?" Lean stormed out, furious, and never asked Malcolm to work for him again. Within a couple of years of Malcolm joining Faber, he had written the two works which became, and still are, the most performed of all his works in the Faber catalogue, Four Cornish Dances and Peterloo Overture. The first characteristic in its gusto and wonderful evocation of mood and atmosphere, with hints of a darker subtext. And the second, a dramatic narrative with one of Malcolm's finest tunes and an extraordinary Iversian central section. We needed every penny we could get to fund publication of the numerous armour works now flowing into us. I think he wrote, from memory, 14 large-scale works while he was in Cornwall, and a whole string of smaller works too, so he was beginning to keep us very busy. We carefully checked returns from the PRS, which handles income generated by performances, and found they'd missed a lot. So we started logging every single performance and broadcast and regularly notifying them to PRS. The number of unpaid fees reduced dramatically. Malcolm thought this was a great idea. The best letters he ever received, he said, were the ones containing a PRS check. Malcolm, incidentally, must have spent a lot on his wardrobe. He was always impeccably dressed in well-cut suits whenever I saw him. His generosity in entertaining was legendary. He'd never let Donald pay for the many lunches they had together unless it was for his birthday or some other special occasion. He announced one day that he wanted to stand Donald and me a thank you lunch at the Connaught Hotel in London where he was staying. There was champagne, and we didn't get away till 6 o'clock. On another occasion, when he was living in Ireland, he came to visit our office and met all the younger members of staff. A couple of days later, they were all summoned to the Carlton Towers Hotel in London for a party he was giving for some youthful Irish friends he invited over. He always loved having young people around him. But this sort of extravagance led to the severe financial problems he had in the early 70s that precipitated the move from Cornwall to Ireland, where the income tax regime was much more favourable. Malcolm's caustic quips. Malcolm was expansive when he talked and a great raconteur, but in correspondence, he was economical with words. He also had a ready wit, but these two elements came together in what might be called his caustic quips, which arrived on postcards from time to time. Here are some examples. First, Donald has told Malcolm that Michael Dyack of Patterson, his previous publishers, had withdrawn an offer to transfer some Patterson works to Faber, and he receives the following. Dear Donald, tell Michael he's a SHIT. Yours, Malcolm. Second, Malcolm has written a carol setting a poem by Mary Wilson, wife of the then Prime Minister Harold Wilson, and sent it to her. Faber, anxious to publish it, soon asked Malcolm what's happening. Had not yet heard from her, he writes. I suppose she has not yet had clearance from the CIA. Last, Malcolm has returned to England after staying with the Waltons in Ischia. Italy a great success, he writes, and I'm sad to be back in an aggressive police state. Next, new works. Receiving a new work from Malcolm was always a great event. Musically, the only predictable thing about it was its unpredictability. He had a vast knowledge of music of all types, classical, jazz, pop, you name it, and would draw on this knowledge to select whatever idiom or idioms he felt to be appropriate to a particular work. In the luxurious days before emails, we would take off many hours, as many as were necessary, to digest a new score and see what was going on in it. Malcolm's fair copy of a score was written in his bold, clear, fluent hand. He usually prepared it straight from sketches, and typically it was completely error-free, apart from a few minor slips. That's certainly not true of all composers. Scores produced in times of stress, however, could be riddled with mistakes and had to be checked very carefully. He was thoroughly professional about completing works in good time, especially if instrumental parts had to be repaired. He never revised his works. He always told us promptly of any errors in score or parts he'd spotted when conducting the first performance or first recording. In these respects, he was a model composer from a publisher's point of view. But on the other hand, as I implied earlier, he never prepared piano reductions for concerto and so on, even when he said he would. He also tended to be pretty cavalier about reading the music proofs of new scores that we sent to him. This leads directly to publishing. In the early days, there were some teething problems. For example, Malcolm didn't like the style of our orchestral parts for Four Cornish Dances and wrote a detailed letter explaining why. It ended, a bit pretentiously, The hostility towards all modern music makes it vital that the material from which players play should be absolutely impeccable. This is Malcolm riding a hobby horse, of course, but what a good maxim for a publisher. We immediately had the parts recopied, and I don't recall his beefing about our parts ever again. Right from the beginning, Faber Music took a lot of trouble over the production and design of its printed publications. When the Royal Society of Arts instigating annual awards for graphic excellence in music publishing, we won them every year. We published printed editions of all Malcolm's works, something that is not standard practice for new music among all publishers. They were released as quickly as possible to get the works into circulation, and a lot of copies were sent out free for promotion to performers, institutions, and so on. Malcolm always wrote an appreciative note of thanks when a newly published score was sent to him. For his 70th birthday, we produced a handsome new computer set edition of his 7th Symphony full score, which we presented to him as a birthday present. Next topic: Malcolm's attitude to his own music. The act of composing was absolutely central to Malcolm's life. While engaged in it, he would be completely focused on the job, putting everything else aside, even drinking. I saw him when he was writing his 8th Symphony, alone in a little flat in Belsize Park. It was a period of great mental turmoil, and he was under medical care in a nearby hospital, but allowed out for part of the day. While he was composing, his self-discipline and mental application were total. He was utterly absorbed in what he was doing, his depression temporarily banished. Once the work was finished, however, restraint went to the winds, and he would go on a blinder and run riot, sometimes for days. I experienced this when I went over to Dublin to collect the manuscript of his 7th Symphony, and he took me on a non-stop pub crawl for 2 solid days. Gosh, I remember that. I did it at the time. Malcolm did not like his concert works to be arranged. He used to say, "If I wanted it like that, I'd have written it that way myself." While not being actually secretive, he never volunteered information on the compositional aspects of his music. Other music, yes, but his own, never. If you put a specific question to him, he would sometimes answer it, but more usually brush it aside. I found him equally reluctant to talk about the expressive content of a work and what lay behind it. He provided a short program note for most of his concert works and generally left it at that. It was important to Malcolm to attend the first performance of every new composition. For an orchestral work, he conducted the premiere and first recording wherever possible. This was not only a question of establishing his own reading, he also saw it somehow as his moral right. He threatened once legal action when the EMI proposed to release an unauthorized recording, and he stopped it. In any case, as you'll know, he was a very fine conductor. Players loved working for him and gave him their very best. Though he'd always enjoyed performing his work and seldom passed over an opportunity to do so, he was not possessive about his music. Once a new work was written and launched, it was up to others to make of it what they could. He became curiously detached from it. In addition, he often adopted a self-depreciating stance on his compositions, doubtless a defensive strategy, since he was not generally renowned for modesty. Malcolm loved receiving accolades, especially from his audiences. What composer doesn't? Conversely, as we have seen, he was deeply wounded by hostile reviews from critics. No wonder he lashed out at them from time to time, both verbally and in print. This leads directly to my next topic, critics and the musical establishment. During much of the Faber years, the majority of English critics continued to disparage Malcolm's most important works, his new symphonies and the other works of personal expression, despite Faber's best efforts to swing opinion round. From the late 60s, the tone of these works was becoming darker, with more dissonance and more disruptive episodes. Donald Mitchell has referred to their, quote, unsettling disclosures of the human predicament. Hugo Cole and Edward Greenfield were among the few English critics to be impressed by them, though some appreciative reviews also came from America. However, extravert works, such as the Philharmonic Concerto and the Second Clarinet Concerto, written for Benny Goodman, fared much better, both getting rave reviews. The bittersweet concertos, for example those for two pianos, for viola, and the Second Flute Concerto, were also well received. Within the English musical establishment, Malcolm had his loyal supporters. One thinks of the conductors, Sir Charles Groves and Edward Downes, the orchestral manager, Gerald MacDonald, and above all, David Ellis, the producer at BBC North. Donald and others at Faber were able to some extent to increase the circle. The BBC's controller of music, William Glott, for example, who was an ardent modernist, forwarded the premiere of the Sixth Symphony by the BBC Northern. Malcolm had written it uncommissioned. He further recognised Malcolm's talents by commissioning 2 works from the Proms and giving him conducting engagements. However, his successor, Robert Ponsonby, disregarded Malcolm, despite strenuous lobbying. Malcolm received the first of many academic honours in 1969, an honorary doctorate of music from Exeter University, which didn't seem to impress the musical establishment very much. I think they took more note as the list of honours and distinctions increased with the passing years. And Malcolm, as you know, got a great many honours from universities and a lot of other organisations too, until, of course, his knighthood in 1993. Faber continually lobbied individuals, but it was often hard work. For more general promotion, apart from issuing press releases, informative catalogues, digests of favourable reviews, and so on, we put out campaigning material in our house journal, Faber Music News, and its successor, Fortissimo, which were widely circulated to performers, institutions, and others. An early example was an article by Arthur Hutchins, professor at Durham University, a very pungent piece that challenged Malcolm's critics head-on, particularly over his use of melody. He wrote, alongside Malcolm's, command of attractive orchestration and his easy repositioning of harmonic effects, especially passing bitonality, Arnold finds what Mozart called il filo, the thread, in melodic line. It is far harder to achieve this than to pose as a serious composer by keeping contrapuntal tags running around in a texture like errant weevils in cheese. So much for the serialists. Later in the 1980s, we continued the process by publishing Alan Poulton's catalogue, The Music of Malcolm Arnold, the first full documentation of his output up to that time, and by commissioning Hugo Cole to write an informed commentary on all his works, putting Malcolm into perspective as a composer. It was a perceptive and well-written study, the first of its kind to be written. The tide of opinion on Malcolm's serious music was beginning to change for the better, and I think both books made a significant contribution to that change. A word next about Britten and Arnold. The two stars in the Faber firmament could not have been more different. The Apollonian Britten, fastidious, homosexual, and the Dionysian Arnold, reveling in excess, a great womanizer.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, they had certain beliefs in common. Socialist principles, the belief that composers should fulfill a useful role in society, and a belief in the power of music to communicate. As people, they were pretty wary of each other, particularly in Britten's case, since Malcolm was apt to be rude about him in public. When Ted Heath gave a 70th birthday dinner for William Walton at number 10 Downing Street, a snub from Malcolm across the table sent Britten angrily out of the room. However, Britten had given a platform to Malcolm at the Albury Festival for the premiere of his guitar concerto, and, with some persuasion from Donald, he did so again for premieres of the second flute concerto and the second string quartet. An Albury Festival premiere is good news. It is not only broadcast on Radio 3, but also recorded by the BBC Transcription Service and broadcast in countries throughout the world. However, the string quartet was to be the last Arnold premiere at the festival. After the performance, Malcolm went backstage to the green room, where I joined him with James Burnett, head of the BBC Transcription Service. Britten and Piers came in and offered congratulations, rather hard-heartedly, I thought. As they were leaving, Malcolm turned to James Burnett and said in a resonant stage whisper, "I say, Jimmy, am I going to bugger you tonight, or will you bugger me?" I have to say something about ups and downs caused by Malcolm's manic depression and his later mental collapse. This will be very much from my own personal viewpoint. People who lived close to Malcolm found his mood swings a terrible trial. During most of the Cornish period and the first part of the Dublin period, we at Faber saw mostly his upside. But even then, a change of mood could come out of the blue, and he'd suddenly turn nasty. Don said that being with Malcolm was like being on top of a volcano, never knowing when it would erupt. The year 1970, when Malcolm was under some stress, proved the first trying time for Faber. He completely blew a commission for the ECO that we worked hard to get for him. They wanted a showpiece demonstrating the individual virtuosity of their players. He gave them a gloomy, acerbic piece that flattered no one, least of all himself. Later that year, he cancelled most of his conducting commitments, including dates playing his own works that we'd helped to plan with his agent. He followed this by an excoriating attack on critics in The Guardian, just at the time he'd been getting some more favourable reviews. All very frustrating. I must add, as an aside, that the ECO debacle was a one-off. Malcolm was expert in giving commissioners their money's worth, and I can't remember another dissatisfied customer. Also, with his astonishing ability to write idiomatically for any instrument, he was adept at satisfying musicians for whom he wrote works, concertos, chamber works, or solo pieces. He had an astonishing knowledge of each instrument. He could write idiomatically for any part of any instrument. It was an absolutely amazing ability. Even the players were astonished at it. Malcolm's downward swing in the latter Cornish years, however, was soon countered by a definite up following his move to Dublin in March 1972. It ushered in a very productive period for composition, with 3 large works completed within a year and preliminary work on a new symphony, his seventh. I didn't see much of him then until the premiere of the Second Flute Concerto in June 1973. We'd rented a house at Aldborough during the festival, and Malcolm spent an afternoon with us, bringing his daughter Catherine and his son Robert. He was at his most charming and amusing. The concerto went down very well. Afterwards, a certain lady critic was unwise enough to go to his hotel for a late-night drink. During the chase that ensued round his room, various bits of furniture got smashed, and the manager subsequently asked Malcolm to pay up and leave. We all thought, Malcolm's back on form. But it was short-lived. Back in Dublin, though he soon completed the Seventh Symphony and went on to write 6 other sizable works, and a lot of smaller ones too. The terrific cycles of the illness were to carry on inexorably, causing his wife Isabel to leave him and leading eventually to 2 suicide attempts. After the second one, Donald intervened with a strongly worded letter to Malcolm. Your family and friends cannot stand by and see you destroy yourself, was his message. You must return to the UK for treatment. He continued, things cannot be allowed to go on just as in the past. You have a wonderful creative talent which must at all costs be preserved. There are still many fine works which you have to write. I'm sure you know that to be the truth, and that the moment has come when you cannot afford to take further risks. Please, Malcolm, do take these words seriously and accept the advice that is offered. Malcolm was treated in Dublin at first, and then took this advice and found treatment in a London hospital. This was the Belsize Park period, when his mental disturbance gradually became more acute. It came to a head in a major psychotic incident while he was staying in Bournemouth to conduct recording sessions for EMI for a lot of works of his. What happened, including my attempt to pick up the pieces, is well told by Meredith and Harris, so I won't tell it again now. The eventual outcome was Malcolm being committed to the St Andrew's Psychiatric Hospital in Northampton, where, on the occasions I visited him, depression and heavy medication had turned him into a pitiful ghost of his former self. During the 6.5 years of the Belsize Park and Northampton periods, he was to compose only 3 works. The last of them, the trumpet concerto, was dragged out of him by the amazing Sally Charlton, a large woman with a large personality who ran a pub near St Andrew's Hospital and began inviting Malcolm when he was better, but when his health had improved a little, into her home. You're a composer, she said, setting him up in a room with pencil and paper. Now, get on and compose. When the concerto was finished, she came down to London with Malcolm and handed the manuscript to us at Faber. If this work is no good, she said, let me know, and I'll tell him to do it again. It was clearly the product of a diminished creativity, but it worked in performance, and the fact that it existed at all was a miracle. Rehabilitation continued after the move to Norfolk in 1984 with his carer Anthony Day. The word rescue has been used to describe what Anthony did for Malcolm, and it was a major achievement to bring some stability, self-respect and dignity into Malcolm's life, and to rekindle the spark of his creativity. We continued to visit Malcolm in Norfolk and to see him at concerts and other events. A couple of times a year, we threw a lunch party to him at our local Italian restaurant, Trattoria Verdi, which he always called Joe Green, literal translation, which was attended by a good quorum of the Faber staff. He could become quite animated at these lunches, and the ladies occasionally found his hand caressing their thighs under the tape. The first work Malcolm completed in Norfolk was four Irish dances. He planned to write these in his time in Ireland, but somehow never got on with it. He dedicated them to Donald, who had first urged him to write the work when Malcolm moved to Dublin some 14 years earlier. The first of the dances was, in fact, written in 1978-9, when he was in Belsize Park, and showed Malcolm, if not at his very best, at least in ebullient command of the orchestra. The three movements he now added in 1986 were quite different: brief, spare in the extreme, and without thematic development. Meredith and Harris note that brain damage identified by a recent medical scan that Malcolm had permanently impaired his creative abilities. Of the 7 works written by Malcolm in 1986 and 87, the most significant was the Ninth Symphony. It was this work that was to bring the Faber years to their close. When Donald first looked at the score, with pages and pages of only 2 instrumental lines and constant repetitions, he was baffled. An attempt to get Malcolm to talk about the work failed completely. Meredith and Harris include my account of this in their book, so again, I won't repeat it now. I mentioned earlier that the tide of opinion on Malcolm's serious music was beginning to change for the better. Donald felt that publication of such a bizarre work at this juncture could be prejudicial to this change, and therefore do Malcolm a disservice. This was the principal reason for Faber's decision not to publish the work. It was not made for commercial reasons. We had, in fact, already prepared the orchestral parts of the symphony at our expense for a run-through, and were to publish other of the, quote, spare and strange, unquote, late works. We held back on the symphony at the time in the same spirit of support that we had been extending to Malcolm over the years in Fair Days and in Foul. I'm fully prepared to admit that we may have been wrong. Novello took on the symphony and other late works. With that, formally speaking, the Faber years were over. But of course, they're not over, since the work of introducing Malcolm's music to new generations of performers and winning him new admirers goes on apace and must continue to do so. Faber's present chief executive is listening as I speak, and I hope that he and his successors will always tackle this work with the same commitment and entrepreneurial zeal that Donald Mitchell and the rest of us did from the start of the Faber years. Performances, and above all recordings, have now enabled us to become more familiar with Malcolm's legacy. His legacy of works in all their glorious diversity, not least works that were so puzzling when we first encountered them. There is no doubt in my mind that this legacy will be increasingly valued in years to come. I feel very proud to have worked with and for such a fine and original composer. Thank you.
I think the warmth of that applause says it all. And that was such a informative and insightful and personal and certainly a very moving account of a very important period in Malcolm's life. And we would like to thank you, Martin, so much for expressing it so articulately and eruditely. And it was a very special talk. Thank you so much.
To say one thing, that when I came to prepare the talk and look back on all the things that had happened and the various experiences that we had with Malcolm, I felt I kind of saw something much wider than anything that I'd seen when I was actually on the job. And it was a very happy experience for me to prepare the talk. Ooh.